the US versus Russia, Russia oil imports, and Don't Say Gay Bill. I'm Foday Sillah, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Foday Sillah. Joining us today are libertarian and young voice contributor, Regan Ferrell.
Hi, Foday, it's great to be here.
Next up is conservative writer and editor, Brian McNicoll.
Hello, good evening.
And finally, progressive political reporter, James Rosen.
Good to be here, Foday.
This week, the Pentagon nixed a proposed deal that would have sent Polish fighter jets to Ukraine and American jets to Poland. US officials were concerned that the deal would have raised serious questions about NATO in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. This comes after US officials rejected the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. My question is to Mr. Rosen. Does the US risk a world war by having such ideas?
Well, I wasn't alive in the 1930s, but I've read a lot of history about that period. And this is starting to become eerily reminiscent of the years leading up to our entry into World War II, before we directly got involved. After the attack in Pearl Harbor, we gave materials and weapons to Great Britain, which was under direct attack and bombing raids by the Germans, by the Nazi air forces. And there was the same sort of debates going on now. That doesn't mean we're headed toward a world war, but we're having to answer as a country and as a government, starting with President Biden, we're having to answer the same very difficult questions, which is, as we take more and more steps, some of them baby steps, some of them bigger steps, to helping Ukraine, do we risk direct confrontation with Russia? According to our treaty obligations under NATO, Ukraine's not a member of NATO. We're not obligated to help Ukraine. And in 2014, when Russia made a smaller incursion into Ukraine, the Pentagon and then President Obama rejected pleas from the Ukrainian government to send them more weapons and heavier weapons, more forceful weapons. This time, it looks like it's a closer call. Poland, I thought, came up with a fascinating kind of workaround, which is we send Poland planes, which we can do because they're a NATO ally, and then Poland sends used planes to Ukraine. Poland would get new planes in exchange for giving up some of their used planes. Poland didn't handle it diplomatically very well because, as far as I understand, the Polish government officials didn't tell the United States about this idea before they made it public, which wasn't smart. But the short answer to your question is, I feel like we are slowly being drawn into war. I don't take completely at his word President Putin's claim that that this kind of aid, indirect aid, means a direct military confrontation with Russia. If we try to enforce a no-fly zone, that's a different question, because that could draw us into direct confrontation with Russian pilots.
Our Secretary of State told them, to send bits to the Ukraine, and the Poles said, we'll send them to you, and you send them to Ukraine, and then you resupply us with F-18. And then we're like, well, it's risky for us to be involved. To which the Poles said, well, you were willing for us to take that risk, but not yourself. And I think that's a large part of why they balked at this, is they're like, this is a lot of risk to us that the United States is putting us out there to take, and they're not really willing to take. We've gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble here. We don't really have, a lot of people at our back. Like, both Gulf Wars, we built these pretty substantial coalitions that backed what we did. We were not going to run out of supplies or options or whatnot in those wars. But this one, we're kind of on our own. The Russians are negotiating more with the French than they are with us. And so, we're sort of lost in this. We've not been real effective in pretty much anything we've tried to do.
And Ms. Farrell, what is your opinion on this topic?
I wholeheartedly agree with Brian and James. I'd like to add that as far as I see it, Poland is in the hot seat, and so they have the incentive here to point fingers at us. They've been encouraging us to send them the F-16s, which James mentioned, and they would be sending MiG-29s to Germany. Now, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has already said that any country that allows Ukrainian operated airplanes to use their soil would be considered a participant in the conflict. I'm not sure how this extends to any fighter jets that we would send to the Ukraine, but I have to imagine that this would be tantamount to starting World War III. And because we are sending it from Germany, which is a NATO ally, it would breach Article 5 of the NATO agreement.
I also think that I don't know that how much we ought to be worried about whether the Russians think we're a combatant. What are they going to do? They can't. They're not beating Ukraine.
But what if he uses tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine?
So our nuclear policy is supposed to be that if you use nukes or chemical weapons, we respond with nukes. So if he does that, if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, he's letting us nuke him.
Well, I mean, I don't want to dominate, but I mean, President Assad of Syria used chemical weapons, and we famously did nothing.
Well, that's true. Well, we didn't do nothing, but we didn't nuke. We did not nuke him. Right. So, but that's supposedly the policy.
I can appreciate that. I think it's more about egging on any NATO allies. You're also seeing Bulgaria and Slovakia being called to send in troops or send in reinforcements. And so as soon as one NATO ally gets involved, we have to respond in kind.
Also this week, President Biden pulled the plug on oil imports from Russia. Here's the president.
Today, I'm announcing the United States is targeting the main artery of Russia's economy. We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. This is a move that has strong bipartisan support in the Congress and I believe in the country. Americans have rallied to support their Ukrainian people and made it clear we will not be part of subsidizing Putin's war.
All right, guys. My question is to Mr. McNicoll. Does this hurt us more than it hurts the Russian?
Well, if you get the rest of the world to line up behind it, it's basically the Russians' only source of hard currency. Their workaround, they say, in the early going, is going to be to use the Chinese currency, base it on Chinese currency instead of the dollar. They're trying to, remove the dollar as the global currency. But I mean, who other than Russia and China is going to accept payment for anything and renminbi, right? I mean, it's going to have to be converted to dollars at some point. Also, the Russians get less for the oil they sell to China. China appears to be ready to buy some, and they need a lot. So, the fraction in the oil market is a problem for China, a bigger problem for them than us, because they have to buy nearly all their oil on the open market. So Russia won't get top dollar for what it sells from China, and obviously won't get anything for what I guess about 10% of what they were doing came to us in various forms. We kind of jumped off without a plan here. His plan was to call Soviets in the UAE and so forth, and ask them to ramp up production to cover the shortfall. but they wouldn't take his call. They're saying, hey, on the other side of the thing, you're working with Iran to rejoin JITPOA and free up money for them, relieve them of sanctions and so forth, and that's our enemy. So we're not inclined to help you at all. So we're the American people are in a situation where gas, we had the worst. Gas went up 49 cents just last week. That was the biggest price hike ever, and the president is pretty much saying it's going to go up more, and we're not going to do anything about it.
And Ms. Farrell, where do you side in this?
I have to agree with Brian. We jumped off the plane without a parachute. I do have to say, I think it's going to hurt Americans more than it's hurting Russia. We haven't had Europe agree to the oil sanctions. Russian oil is only about 5% of what we're receiving when it comes to oil, but you're still seeing prices rise, particularly coming off of the pandemic, inflation. You're seeing the American pocketbooks really hurting, and yet Europe and China and India are still very reliant on Russia. And I think it's largely a symbolic gesture in solidarity with Ukraine rather than something that's actually going to hurt Russian pocketbooks, certainly Russian oil oligarchs.
Mr. Rosen, I would love to hear your opinion.
Well, I agree that it is at least partly symbolic, but and I think the 5% figure that Regan just cited, I think my understanding is a bit low. I thought it was closer to 10%, but whether it's 8%, 9%, I mean that is not pocket change to Russia, especially in league with the other sanctions that are hitting its economy hard and limiting hard currency from other sources. So it is. I agree. It's partly symbolic. It's not entirely symbolic. And one question is, I mean, there's been some question. Germany, I think, gets 40% of its natural gas and oil from Russia. There is some sentiment in the German public. I think I read close to 50%, maybe more now, to limit those imports. So it will bite more than symbolically. I want to respond to what's been said by a couple of my fellow panelists that we kind of have been going into this blindly. We've jumped off the plane without a parachute. I think that the incredibly united response we've seen in Europe, I think it's 27 NATO members and some non-NATO members, is not by accident. I think the Biden administration, for months behind the scenes, without taking credit, organized this response among Europe, planned for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the change among our allies in Europe from kind of pacifism and non-involvement to a more aggressive stance. It seems to have happened overnight, but I think it was a longer process. And I think the Biden administration and Secretary of State Blinken in particular played a big role in that.
I really don't see that much has come from it. And it's like the rest of NATO doesn't seem to be acting in concert with us. They seem to be, worried about their own skin, as is like Taiwan and so forth. I mean, because I think what has been exposed here is that we're not really willing to take action to defend anybody. If it's a NATO power, then we will see. But so far, it's like we're really not doing a whole lot to stop the Russians from conquering Ukraine. And as for the energy problem, it's like the fix is getting harder by the day, because what we have done is we cut off, we turned off the pipeline, we cut all drilling on federal lands, we've quit letting leases, and we cut off the leases that were supposed to be in Alaska. We've sent the signal to the world that we're anti-energy now, that we're going to try to make it all on green like Europe did. That's part of what provoked or gave Putin the opportunity to do this, is that we're vulnerable on energy. The Germans can't really take the action they should be taking here because they're really vulnerable on this, and most of Europe is vulnerable on this. So, I mean, they're sort of in a box here with energy.
I have to agree with you, Brian. I think shutting down nuclear power plants in Europe also sent the signal to Russia that now these countries aren't energy independent and they're even more reliant on Russian oil. And this is the perfect time for him to make moves on Ukraine and possibly put Belarus back under its sphere of influence more than it already is. We'll see.
I just want to jump in and say I think Brian and to some extent Reagan are asking for too much too quickly. It seems like months ago that the invasion started. I think it's been 15 days. I mean, it's scarcely 2 weeks. And in the scheme of things, if you read about, I mean, all of history happens faster now, partly because of social media. But if you read about how the build up to World War II, it took place over a period of several years. Even though Germany was being much more aggressive over a much bigger part of Europe than Putin and Russia are being now in Ukraine. I think a lot has happened. A lot has happened in a very short period of time. The House at 1:30 in the morning, I think it was last night, I lose track of time, or 2 nights ago, passed a what was the figure? It was astounding.
14 billion
something
for
like
Ukraine.
13 was it 13.6? No, I think it was 13.6 billion dollars in aid to Ukraine. By large bipartisan, the Senate's going to rush it through. Our NATO allies are also rushing through aid. That is, for a country like Ukraine, tens of billions of dollars that they're going to start getting immediately. That is real money. It's going to have an immediate effect. And it's also, you talk about signals, money talks. It is signaling to Russia that we're willing to spend unprecedented amounts of money to bolster the Ukrainian economy, to bolster the Ukrainian military. So I think things are happening. I'm much more positive. I think they're happening much more quickly than my fellow panelists are giving credit for.
All right. And finally, the Florida legislature passed the so-called Don't Say Gay bill. Here's the story from ABC News.
Tonight, Florida's controversial legislation, dubbed by critics as the Don't Say Gay bill and gaining national attention, has been sent to Governor Ron DeSantis to sign, the governor already signaling he supports it. The state Senate passing the bill 22-17 today, despite days of protests from the LGBTQ community and thousands of students. Officially called the Parental Rights in Education Bill, the measure bans lessons regarding sexual orientation or gender identity in grades K through 3rd, and any instruction that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate according to state standards. Those standards, however, not yet in place for several grades.
All it does is state what is age, it talks about what's appropriate in the classroom to teach, and then it talks about the fact that the parent has the right to be engaged in the education of their children.
And I'm going to start this topic with a question to Ms. Farrell. Is the outrage a bit absurd about this bill?
I think to an extent. I think that it limits the freedom of expression of the students and teachers. The bill forbids instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through 3rd grade. I don't know if all of the middle schoolers and high schoolers protesting realize that it's not limiting the instruction in their grades, but just in the elementary school. I think it's even more evidence that school choice is necessary for the future. There will never be any consensus on what we should be teaching our children, and we're always going to be making trade-offs on what the students should be hearing and listening. My concern is that you're not giving resources to LGBT students, and even as young as kindergarten, first, second, 3rd grade, these students already know. For me at that age, it wasn't a question of whether or not I liked women, but whether or not I could talk about it. But I still understand these parents' instincts to prevent what they may be worried about, whether that's due to their faith or their morals or something else, that they are worried about the education that their children are receiving. They don't have a hand in it.
Mr. Rosen, where do you stand?
Well, look, the train has already left the station on the issue of gay rights in this country. I mean, how far we have come in the last 10 years is astounding. 10 years ago, Gay people were denied all kinds of basic rights, government aid. Now, even in Republican states, Republican legislatures, they're not. I think the folks who are behind this bill are fighting a losing battle. Society, is changing quickly, has already changed and is changing quickly. And, you can pass a law like this, but how will you enforce it? How will you stop children from, as Regan said, how will you stop children from saying what they want to say? And are you going to fire teachers of younger students if they choose to jump into this conversation? It's a conversation that's been going on throughout our entire society for, robustly for the last 10 years. So, this is, you talk about symbolism, this is largely a symbolic law. It's just that it's hard enough when you're a young gay person. It's hard enough to deal with the obstacles that you might face, the hesitations you might face starting within your own family. This adds to the burden. I think it's really a shame.
And Mr. McNicoll, apologies. What's your opinion on this topic?
A couple of things about it. One is it's narrow. It seems to me narrowly tailored to keep these conversations from coming out, before the fourth grade. And I don't think that, I don't know. I don't think that it helps to talk about it before the fourth grade. Like you were saying, I don't think that people, even people who are gay, right? I don't think that that you need to be getting reinforced over at that age, right? It needs to be sort of, that's, if you are reinforced for point, any kind of talk about that area should be at home, should come from parents. I think that what this bill tells you, though, is that the question of gay rights may be settled in the United States, but the question that's being undertaken now is parents' rights. Is how much rights do parents have to look at curriculum and make have their will carried out and what gets taught and what gets not taught, and that voice was getting ignored. Okay, so now that voice is getting a lot of attention. So, it may go from too little influence on the question to too much influence on the question. And, and then society would have to adjust again. But, I think that right now the momentum is toward, I think that's what happened in the Virginia governor's race, for instance, is, the thing that hurt McAuliffe the most was when he said, it wasn't parents' job to decide what goes on in schools. I think a lot of people picked up on that and said, yes, it is. It's our kids, and we want certain things and so forth. And I think there's going to be some roiling, and there's going to be some laws like this that press up against the limits of what constitutes too far in this area. But then I think you will see it'll settle back to a point where parents have more involvement than they did, and the things that they are offering are practical. So I think you have to let that process play out. And I think, James is right. The horse left the barn on this one. And I don't think it's terrible as long as it isn't,
I think
gay people should be able to talk about being gay. Gay teachers instructing young students on it. You maybe should be using some restraint, right? You should be thinking about let the parents have the say in this until they get old enough to understand what they're talking about and what the choices are. And there's a reason we don't let, it's illegal to have sex with children, right? Because we say that these are choices that children do not fully understand the ramifications of, so we protect them from having to make those choices. So I think that's kind of where this is. And I think that Regan is right that, another thing that's happening here is, people are getting out of the public school system because they're feeling that they're not being heard on things like this. So, I think it's important that if Florida wants to have people in its public schools, that it responds.
Ms. Farrell, you have anything to add to that?
yes, I was going to say to push back perhaps on my own comments prior. The concern that I do have is that if young students aren't able to discuss this with their families at home, and then they have no one else to turn to in the school, what that will do to their mental health, their psyche, their learning, and their educational experience. And so, like James said, you're not going to remove these discussions from happening. The bill doesn't actually limit spontaneous discussion. It only limits the material from being placed in the official curriculum. These students are already going to be seeing it on social media. They're going to be talking amongst themselves, but there needs to be some sort of outlet other than the parent in case that is not a safe place for them to discuss it in order to do so. And so I think if perhaps there was an exception made for guidance counselors, principals, or some facilitated, mediated conversation with the parents that this could happen in, you would be able to bridge a lot more of that, assuage a lot more of that concern.
All right, let me ask you this: would you said you were dealing with this from a young age? Would you have wanted your parents to know then?
They did.
Huh?
They did.
They did. Okay.
I was just outspoken, and I came from a very loving family, and so that was I was very lucky, but not everyone is. And so if there is no other outlet, or in a place that might a situation that might be abusive, it could be actually dangerous to engage in that conversation with their parents. And some kids may already know that, and if they feel it's against the law to speak to a teacher about it now, because they might not understand it fully, that could also impact that student's livelihood.
Now let's take some questions from our viewers. The first question we are gonna receive today is from Stacy Holloway. Ms. Holloway says, if sending planes to Ukraine violates NATO bylaws, then why doesn't sending other weapons such as anti-tank missiles?
That's a very good question. I don't know what how the rules of NATO read, but the Russians cannot establish dominance of Ukraine's airspace because of any aircraft, shoulder launched anti-aircraft missiles that the Ukrainians already have. So, if it can be done by that, and people think that makes it legally, cleaner, or whatever keeps them, whatever gives the Ukrainians a chance here, I would be for.
Mr. Rosen?
It's really not a question of whether it violates NATO. It doesn't violate NATO because NATO doesn't forbid giving aid to non-NATO members. I think the question is, to reframe it a little bit, is why is it logical to give smaller weapons, even weapons that can shoot down planes to Ukraine, but not logical to give planes directly that can go up and fight the Russian planes? And I think that doesn't really have anything to do with NATO. It has to do with our fear of getting drawn more into a direct confrontation with Russia. And Russia,
and the Russians pointed that one out. The Russians have not said anything about the anti-aircraft shoulder-launched missiles, but they've said if anybody who joins in bringing them planes, then they would consider that possible. The Russians do make that distinction for whatever reason.
And we're off to the next question, which is from Jonathan Wolfie. And his question is, if EU countries continues to import Russian oil, then will the US ban have any effort at all?
Yeah, we're 10% of what they buy, or what they sell, or 8 to 10%, somewhere in there, of what they sell. And so, that's, people say, oh, that's not half, that's a lot of, losing 10% of your customer base in one day is tough on that. It'll make the price go down that they are able to sell oil. So, it still has an impact, but I mean, it's, it wasn't going to be a devastating, shot through the heart anyway, right?
No, I think thank you for correcting me from before, the 8 to 10%, whatever the percentage is that we have, isn't as impactful as 50%. If we could have done this with Europe as a united front, I think it would have been much more impactful. But I don't think that it's nothing.
I'm not sure I agree that that it's just flat out that Europe is not cutting its imports or not going to cut its imports. Again, you have to give these things a little bit of time to unfold. It's been a little more than 2 weeks. And I know in Germany, which is the biggest economy and the biggest importer of Russian gas among all of our NATO allies, there's a lot of pressure on the German government to at least reduce its imports, and feeling that the Germans are willing to absorb some of the pain, pay higher gas prices. So I think it's too early to say Europe is not cutting its oil and gas imports.
Now it's time for the most underrated story of the week. Which one of you guys would like to go first?
The Supreme Court is considering a case called West Virginia versus EPA. It challenges the findings in Massachusetts v. EPA that carbon dioxide by itself is a greenhouse gas and it's a harmful gas that they can regulate. If it is believed that they have 6 votes, West Virginia has 6 votes, which would remove the endangerment finding of carbon dioxide. If that happens, the carbon dioxide is not a regulated gas anymore. That means all these, a lot of the global warming law that we have is based on that. So, a lot of our global warming strategy would have to change on a dime. I think it would change for the better.
All right, Ms. Farrell, do you have any stories for a young man like me to check out?
I do. The underrated story for me for the month has been the Earn It Act. Its name is the Eliminating Abuse and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies Act of 2022. That's a mouthful. Its ostensible purpose and its stated purpose is to establish a national commission on online child sexual exploitation, prevention, and other purposes. But what this really is a Section 230 carve-out. The Earn It Act would push private companies to scan and survey for content online, any child sexual abuse material, but largely this would be, in practice, this would largely be any sexual material and not just child sexual abuse material. And they'd be doing this by looking through what is on your public page, but also in your DMs and your private messages. And I'm just very skeptical that an apparatus used to survey like that would not be used in the future for something else. And I think you can come up with a much better way to address child sexual abuse material online than going through people's private messages. It's incredibly compromising to digital privacy and free expression.
Mr. Rosen, do you have any stories for me today?
Yes, I have an underreported story, a non-reported story, which is that headline, gas prices have not hit a record high. The mainstream media, from the New York Times to NPR to CBS and CNN have all reported this in recent days. But guess what? I'm going to use AAA figures. They're the biggest automobile association for drivers. They said that on Tuesday, 2 days ago, the gas prices hit $4.17. In July 2008, the gas price, the national average of gas was $4.11. If you take inflation into account, that's not even close to the highest gas price. And if you take, I went to the official United States government inflation calculator, and $4.17 a gallon would equal, in 2008, would equal, $4.11 in 2008 would equal $5.31 now, with inflation taken into account. This is a pet peeve of mine, not to soil my own bed, but reporters habitually report on the biggest government spending bill ever, the biggest deficit ever, the biggest debt ever, without taking inflation into account. It's extremely misleading, and this is an example of it. Now, in Los Angeles, gas prices, according to stories I've read and pictures I've seen, are over $5. So even with inflation in Los Angeles, Southern California, maybe other parts of the country, they are truly reaching record highs. But for me, do I like paying $4.25 a gallon, which is the price in my neighborhood gas station? No, I don't. But it is not a record high. And I will just give credit to the New York Times, since I mentioned them. after the headline about record high gas prices, they did say in the second sentence, in the second paragraph of their story, the figures do not take inflation into account. So I will give the New York Times credit. I didn't see that mentioned at all in other prominent articles or on TV, or it's certainly not that high in the articles. The New York Times gets some credit.
All right. All right, everybody. And that's all we have time for. Thanks to our guests. And thank you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. I'm Foday Sillah. Please hit that subscribe button. Maybe click that like, share it with all your friends. Give us 5-star ratings on all the podcast platforms. And of course, we'll be seeing you next week.